Imagine dedicating 12 years of your life to building the software that transformed a struggling startup into a company worth $400 million. You work late nights, sacrifice weekends, and solve problems nobody else can solve. Then one Friday afternoon, Human Resources calls you into a meeting that lasts exactly 7 minutes. You're thanked for your service, handed a severance package, and escorted out of the building like you never mattered. The executives think they've eliminated the last obstacle standing in the way of a billion-dollar acquisition. But they forgot one critical detail hidden in paperwork signed almost 20 years earlier. The woman they just fired still legally owns nearly half of the patent behind the company's entire AI platform. And by Monday morning, a single signature or the lack of one will decide whether their billion-dollar dream survives or collapses in front of everyone. After giving 12 years to building the software that made my company worth $400 million, they fired me in 7 minutes. The funniest part? They forgot one very expensive detail. I still own the patent. My name is Sarah Whitmore. I'm 49 years old, and for most of my career, I believe that the best engineers didn't need recognition. We just needed problems worth solving. I never chased titles. I never fought office politics. I never cared whose name appeared in press releases. While executives posed for magazine covers, I stayed in my office until midnight writing the code that made those headlines possible. Looking back now, maybe that was my first mistake. 12 years earlier, NovaCore Systems was barely more than a promising startup, renting half a floor above an old warehouse. We had fewer than 20 employees, unstable funding, and a product that barely worked. Most investors considered us another ambitious software company that would disappear within 2 years. Back then, our founder, Michael Lawson, wasn't interested in flashy presentations. He wanted one thing: a software engine that could analyze massive streams of industrial data faster than anyone else. Every major competitor was relying on traditional machine learning pipelines. I believe there was another approach. For almost 2 years, I practically lived inside the office. Weekdays, weekends, Christmas, birthdays. I slept on a couch more times than I can remember. Piece by piece, I designed an entirely new architecture that allowed models to retrain continuously without shutting down production systems. It wasn't glamorous. Most people never saw it. Customers never interacted with the interface I built. But every prediction, every recommendation, every automated decision our flagship AI platform produced flowed through that engine. Michael understood what we had created. One evening, after we filed the original patent application, he invited me into his office. "I can't pay you what this is worth," he admitted. "We barely have enough cash to make payroll." I laughed. "I didn't build it for money." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I don't want investors taking it away from you." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an agreement unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of assigning the patent entirely to the company, we would become co-owners. NovaCore would hold 52%. I would personally retain 48% ownership of the core software patent. It sounded strange at first, almost unnecessary. Michael explained his reasoning. "If one day this company forgets who actually built its foundation, I want the law to remember." I signed. So did he. Our attorneys filed everything properly. Then life moved on. Years passed. The company exploded. 20 employees became 200. Then 500. Major manufacturers adopted our platform. Healthcare companies licensed it. Financial firms integrated it into their own systems. Every funding round pushed our valuation higher. Eventually, analysts estimated NovaCore was worth nearly $400 million. New executives arrived. Marketing departments expanded. Layers of management appeared between engineers and leadership. The startup slowly transformed into a corporation. Michael retired after a health scare. The board appointed a polished CEO named Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't a bad person. He simply believed growth required professional management. Professional management, unfortunately, often mistakes experience for resistance. A year later, he introduced our new Chief Technology Officer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced during an all-hands meeting, "please welcome Jason Reed." The room applauded politely. Jason walked confidently onto the stage wearing expensive sneakers, designer glasses, and the kind of smile that belonged more in venture capital meetings than engineering reviews. He was 31, brilliant according to his resume, successful according to the board, young enough that several senior engineers quietly assumed he couldn't possibly have managed systems as complex as ours. I tried not to judge him too quickly. Age alone means nothing. Some of the smartest developers I've ever met were 24. Some of the worst were 60. Competence isn't measured in birthdays. It's measured in decisions. Jason's first speech sounded inspiring. We're going to modernize engineering culture. We'll eliminate bureaucracy. We'll reward innovation. We'll move faster than ever. Everyone clapped, including me. Then the changes began. Not technical changes. People changes. Developers over 40 quietly disappeared. One accepted early retirement. Another suddenly received poor performance reviews after 10 years of excellent evaluations. A database architect was reassigned to documentation. A senior security specialist resigned after losing every major responsibility he'd held. Officially, these were unrelated decisions. Unofficially, everyone noticed the pattern. The replacements all looked remarkably similar. Fresh graduates. Startup veterans under 30. Employees who admired Jason before they'd even met him. During one architecture meeting, I proposed delaying a feature because our infrastructure couldn't safely support the projected workload. Jason smiled. That's exactly the kind of thinking holding this company back. The room became silent. He turned toward the younger engineers. Legacy engineers often confuse caution with wisdom. A few nervous laughs followed. Then he delivered the sentence that would become his favorite. Legacy engineers become bottlenecks. For the first time in 12 years. I realized I wasn't being challenged. I was being replaced. Over the next few weeks, Jason didn't fire me. He did something far more calculated. He made me invisible. At first, I stopped receiving calendar invitations. The weekly architecture reviews I'd chaired for years suddenly happened without me. When I asked one of the engineering managers why I hadn't been included, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. I assumed Jason talked to you. He said the meetings were being streamlined. Streamlined. Corporate language has an amazing ability to disguise intent. Nobody says you're being pushed aside. They say responsibilities are being redistributed. Nobody says you're no longer trusted. They say leadership is evolving. One word can hide an entire betrayal. Then came the repository permissions. One Monday morning, I opened my laptop to review a pull request. Access denied. I refreshed the page. Same message. I tried another repository. Denied again. At first I assumed there had been some technical mistake. I messaged our DevOps lead. His response came almost immediately. I'm sorry, Sarah. Jason instructed us to move the core repositories under the new platform team. I thought you already knew. I thanked him. It wasn't his decision. 10 minutes later, Jason appeared at my office door. Or rather, what used to be my office. Most senior engineers had already been moved into shared workspaces. Private offices apparently represented outdated hierarchy. He leaned casually against the door frame. Everything okay? I lost repository access. Yes. He answered so casually it almost sounded routine. We're restructuring ownership. I designed those systems. And nobody's questioning that. He smiled. But companies can't depend on one person forever. I never asked them to. Exactly. So we're reducing single points of failure. It was an interesting choice of words. To him, I wasn't an engineer anymore. I was a risk. Over the following month, younger developers started asking me strange questions. Not technical questions. Historical ones. Why does the prediction engine allocate memory this way? Why does the scheduler reject certain optimization paths? Why is this module protected from modification? Every answer was the same. Because otherwise the engine breaks. Most of those decisions had been made years earlier after failures no documentation could fully explain. Experience isn't stored in source code. It's stored in memory. Jason believed documentation could replace people. Reality rarely agrees. Soon production incidents became more frequent. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to create tension. Latency increased. Model retraining occasionally stalled. Memory consumption slowly crept upward after every release. The younger engineers worked hard. Very hard. Many were genuinely talented, but they were trying to understand a machine they'd inherited. Without the people who had built it. Instead of asking why something existed, Jason kept asking why it hadn't been rewritten. Every answer began with the same assumption. The old way must be wrong. One afternoon, I overheard him speaking to a group of directors outside a conference room. We've been carrying too much legacy. We're building a modern engineering organization. I'd rather have adaptable people than historical knowledge. Historical knowledge. That was apparently my new job title. Around the same time, rumors started circulating through the office. Executives from a massive technology company had visited headquarters. Conference rooms were suddenly reserved all day. Outside consultants appeared. Law firms came and went. Finance teams worked unusually late. Nobody officially explained anything. But engineers notice patterns. Especially engineers who've spent decades solving puzzles. Something significant was happening. One evening I ran into Daniel, our CEO, in the parking garage. He looked exhausted, yet strangely excited. Working late again? I asked. He smiled. Big opportunities. I hope they work out. They will. He hesitated for just a moment. I know things have been changing. Jason has. Strong opinions. I nodded. I've noticed. Daniel sighed. Try not to take it personally. It's business. That sentence always fascinates me. People say it's business, as though business exists outside morality. As though respect becomes optional once enough money enters the conversation. 2 weeks later, Human Resources emailed me. Subject line. Confidential meeting request. Friday, 3 p.m. Attendance required. No agenda. I've worked in enough companies to recognize that calendar invitation. Everyone has. You spend years building systems. Then one email tells you you're no longer part of them. Friday arrived. The meeting room contained exactly 3 people. An HR director, Jason, and a legal representative I'd never met. A folder sat neatly in front of my chair. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody asked how I was doing. The HR director began reading from a prepared document. Due to organizational restructuring. Of course. Always restructuring. Never betrayal. Never ambition. Never politics. Just restructuring. She continued for several minutes. My position was being eliminated. My responsibilities had been transitioned. The company appreciated my years of service. I would receive a generous severance package. Health benefits. Career transition assistance. Everything sounded carefully rehearsed. When she finished, Jason finally spoke. I know this isn't easy. His voice carried the polished confidence of someone convinced he was making history. We're taking the platform in a different direction. I understand. We need leaders aligned with the future. I understand. I truly appreciate everything you've contributed. I know. That answer caught him slightly off guard. He expected anger, questions, negotiation. Instead, I simply listened. Then I opened the folder. The severance agreement contained page after page of legal language, confidentiality clauses, non-disparagement clauses, standard employment terms. Nothing unusual. I read every page carefully. Lawyers write important things in very small print. When I reached the signature page, picked up the pen, the HR director looked almost relieved. Jason smiled for the first time during the meeting. 7 minutes after I walked into that room, my employment officially ended. I stood, collected my laptop, picked up the small box containing 12 years of memories, family photos, a coffee mug from our first product launch, an old notebook filled with architectural sketches. As I reached the door, Jason offered one final comment. I genuinely wish you the best. I turned toward him. I believe you. That wasn't sarcasm. I truly believed he wished me well, because he had absolutely no idea what he'd just done. He thought he'd removed the last obstacle to his vision. Instead, he had just separated the company from the one piece of intellectual property it could never legally replace. I drove home without turning on the radio. For the first time in 12 years, I had nowhere I needed to be on Monday morning. No release planning. No architecture reviews. No emergency calls at 2 in the morning because a production cluster had decided to fail at the worst possible moment. Just silence. Some people imagine getting fired feels like freedom. Doesn't. At least not at first. It feels like someone erased a part of your identity. For years, I'd introduced myself by saying, I'm the lead software architect at NovaCore. Now I was simply Sarah. The following morning, I unlocked a filing cabinet in my home office that hadn't been opened in years. Inside were neatly labeled binders, patent filings, licensing agreements, board correspondence from the company's earliest days, original incorporation documents. Most people assume important contracts live forever in digital storage. Experienced lawyers know better. Paper survives software migrations. At the bottom sat the folder Michael Lawson had handed me nearly 2 decades earlier. The signatures were exactly where I remembered. Mine, his, the company's legal counsel, the United States Patent and Trademark Office registration. Every amendment, every ownership confirmation. Nothing had changed. I still legally owned 48% of the core patent protecting the adaptive neural execution engine. More importantly, the licensing agreement contained a clause Michael himself had insisted upon. Neither owner could transfer, sublicense, materially modify, or commercially exploit the patented technology without the written consent of the other. At the time, it had seemed like a safeguard against hostile investors. Now, it had become something else entirely. I called the attorney whose name still appeared on the original paperwork. Richard Collins. He answered on the second ring. Sarah? I need to know if the agreement is still enforceable. He was quiet for a moment. Did something happen? I was terminated yesterday. Another pause. Then his tone changed completely. Don't sign anything else. I already signed the severance agreement. Employment documents don't automatically transfer patent ownership. I thought so. You thought correctly. He asked me to scan every document I had received from HR. Within 2 hours he called back. They never asked for the patent. What? They released an employee. They forgot they were dealing with a patent holder. I leaned back in my chair. Are you certain? As certain as I've been about anything in 35 years. He laughed softly. I honestly can't believe their legal department missed this. Neither could I, unless their legal department had never been told. That possibility bothered me. Large companies don't usually forget assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. People forget. Departments fail to communicate. Executives assume someone else checked. And sometimes, arrogance fills the gaps where diligence should have lived. 3 days later, Richard called again. This situation is larger than I originally thought. How much larger? I've been hearing rumors. What kind of rumors? Acquisition. I frowned. By whom? I don't know yet. But enough firms are billing unusual hours that something major is happening. The answer arrived the following afternoon. Not from Richard. From an old colleague still working inside NovaCore. Emily Chun. She had joined the company only a year after I did. We'd survived product launches, impossible deadlines, and more overnight deployments than either of us could count. She invited me to lunch. After making sure nobody familiar was sitting nearby, she lowered her voice. Jason's been working in complete secrecy. I figured. It's not just restructuring. What is it? She looked around once more. They're selling the company. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. To who? I don't know the final buyer. But everyone says it's over $1 billion. $1 billion. The number almost sounded absurd. Just a few years earlier we'd celebrated reaching a $100 million valuation. Now executives were negotiating 10 times that amount behind closed doors. Emily continued. The board votes next Monday. The announcement comes immediately afterward. Why all the secrecy? Jason wanted engineering cleaned up before due diligence. Cleaned up. Meaning older employees removed. Historical voices silenced. Potential objections eliminated. Suddenly every decision made perfect sense. He wasn't modernizing culture. He was preparing the company for sale. I asked the question already forming in my mind. Has anyone mentioned the patent? Emily looked confused. What patent? Exactly. Nobody knew. Not the engineers. Not middle management. Maybe not even the board. Michael had intentionally kept the ownership agreement limited to only a handful of executives and attorneys. Back then, discretion had protected the company. Now it protected me. That evening, Richard and I met in his office. He had converted one entire conference room into what looked like the preparation for a major trial. Documents covered the table. Corporate filings. Patent registrations. Licensing history. Recent public financial disclosures. He removed his glasses and looked directly at me. I finally know why they're moving so fast. He slid a document across the table. An investment bank had prepared a summary for potential buyers. Every page proudly described the AI platform, scalability, its commercial success, its patented core technology. I smiled slightly. They're selling something they don't fully control. Correct. What happens if they try? They can't legally complete the transaction. What if they ignore us? They won't. Why? Richard tapped the patent certificate. Because every competent corporate attorney will ask the same question. Who owns the intellectual property? And when they discover your name? He didn't need to finish the sentence. The entire acquisition would freeze instantly. Not because I wanted revenge. Because contract law leaves very little room for optimism. Richard closed the folder. I need to ask you something. What? What outcome do you actually want? It was a fair question. I thought about Jason. About the humiliation. About the 7-minute meeting. About 12 years of loyalty dismissed as obsolete. Then I thought about Michael. The company he trusted me to help build. The engineers still working there. Emily. Hundreds of employees who had done nothing wrong. I don't want to destroy NovaCore. I believe you. I want accountability. Richard nodded. Those are very different objectives. Monday morning arrived. Board members from across the country flew into headquarters. Luxury cars filled the executive parking area. Investment bankers carried leather briefcases through the lobby. Outside, financial journalists waited for what they believed would become one of the largest software acquisitions of the year. Inside the main conference room, Jason Reed was preparing to celebrate the biggest victory of his career. He had absolutely no idea that another meeting had just been added to the agenda. At 9:55 that morning, Richard and I walked into NovaCore's headquarters together. Nothing had changed. The same glass lobby. The same reception desk. The same company logo rotating slowly across the massive display wall. For 12 years, I'd walked through those doors as an employee. This time, I entered as a patent owner. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Sarah. She looked surprised. I don't think you're on today's schedule. Richard handed her a business card. You'll want to call your general counsel. Her smile disappeared. Within minutes, 2 attorneys arrived from the executive floor. One of them introduced himself. I'm David Ellis, general counsel for NovaCore. Richard shook his hand. Richard Collins, counsel for Miss Sarah Whitmore. David looked politely confused. What can we help you with? Richard placed a single folder on the reception desk. We understand your board is meeting regarding the proposed acquisition. David's expression changed almost instantly. I'm afraid that's confidential. So is this. Richard opened the folder. The first page was the original patent assignment. The second was the ownership agreement. The third was the licensing restriction requiring unanimous approval from both patent holders before any sale, modification, transfer, or commercial licensing of the protected technology. David read the first page. Then the second. By the third, the color had drained from his face. He looked at me. You still own this? I never sold it. His voice became noticeably quieter. Give me 5 minutes. Took him 3. From the lobby, we watched executives begin rushing through the hallways. Phones appeared. Conference room doors opened. People who had looked completely relaxed only moments earlier suddenly wore expressions I'd seen before during major production outages. Except this wasn't a software failure. It was a legal one. A few minutes later, Daniel Mercer stepped into the lobby. He looked as though he hadn't slept all weekend. When he saw me, he stopped walking. Sarah. I wish this meeting were under better circumstances. He looked at Richard, then back at me. Can we talk privately? We entered a smaller conference room. For a long moment nobody spoke. Finally Daniel broke the silence. I didn't know. I believe you. I was told legal had cleared every intellectual property issue. They didn't. He rubbed his forehead. Jason assured the board ownership was straightforward. It never was. Daniel stared at the agreement in front of him. When Michael negotiated this, he wanted to protect the technology from exactly this situation. Daniel let out a long breath. I should have reviewed the original filings myself. Probably. Before either of us could continue, the conference room door opened. Jason walked in. He still looked confident, until he noticed the documents on the table. His smile disappeared. What is this? Richard answered. The patent. Jason looked irritated rather than concerned. We own the patent. I slid the original agreement toward him. No. You own 52%. I own the other 48%. He laughed. Actually laughed. That can't be right. Richard remained perfectly calm. It is. Jason flipped through the documents faster and faster. His confidence dissolved page by page. This agreement is almost 20 years old. Correct. Why has nobody mentioned this? I looked directly at him. You never asked. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since we'd met, Jason had no speech prepared, no motivational slogan, no lecture about modernization, only questions. This doesn't stop the acquisition. Richard answered immediately. Legally it does. The buyer cannot acquire exclusive rights to the platform. They cannot modify it. They cannot license it. They cannot commercialize future versions. Not without Ms. Whitmore's written approval. Jason turned toward Daniel. Is he serious? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on the general counsel's face already had. Outside the conference room, the board meeting had stopped. Investment bankers were speaking in hurried whispers. Someone from the acquiring company requested an immediate legal review. Another attorney asked for every historical patent filing dating back to the company's founding. Within 45 minutes, the billion-dollar acquisition was effectively frozen. By lunchtime, it was over. The buyer withdrew. Not because the software lacked value, because ownership of its foundation was legally uncertain. Investors reacted immediately. Emergency calls replaced celebration. Board members demanded explanations. Every question eventually led back to one decision. Why had the company's most important engineer been terminated? Without anyone confirming who actually owned its core intellectual property, that afternoon Jason was asked to leave the building. Unlike my meeting, his lasted considerably longer than 7 minutes. The board commissioned an independent investigation. Legal teams reviewed years of internal decisions. Directors discovered that multiple senior engineers had warned leadership against removing experienced staff from critical systems. Those warnings had been ignored. 3 weeks later, Daniel called me. Would you meet with the board? I'll listen. When I entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was completely different from the one I'd left after my termination. Nobody rushed. Nobody interrupted. Nobody talked about legacy engineers. The chairwoman spoke first. We made a series of serious mistakes. I nodded. You did. We'd like to negotiate. I assumed you would. The discussion lasted most of the afternoon. In the end, I agreed to something I never expected. Not because I needed revenge. And not because I wanted my old job back. I became an independent licensing partner. The patent remained partially mine. The company received the long-term rights it needed to operate and continue developing the platform. In return, governance rules were rewritten. No future transfer of the technology could happen without full legal review. Senior technical leadership regained a permanent voice in strategic decisions. And for the first time in years, experience was treated as an asset instead of an obstacle. As for Jason, I never saw him again. I heard he eventually found another executive position. Perhaps he even gave another speech about transforming engineering culture. I hope, for the sake of the people who worked for him, that he finally learned one simple lesson. Software isn't just code. Companies aren't just valuations. And the people who quietly build the foundations of an empire often understand its structure better than the executives living at the top. They thought they fired a programmer. What they actually did was terminate the person who owned the machine keeping their entire empire alive.